Joining us on this lovely sunny Wednesday afternoon. We are lucky to have presenting some very great information for us today. Akile from Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, formerly known as the Law Project. Some people may know it by that name a little bit better. Ooh, Akile, you hit the record for me. Appreciate that because I forgot.
Gotcha.
I forgot. Appreciate it. So we're going to go through some legal nuts and bolts, some things for starting, things for if you're already in existence. We're going to talk entity formation, contracts, high level things, right? As additional folks join us, they can jump right in. Everyone is set to mute. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and put those in the chat and at different points if it's kind of a good place to break. I'll pose those questions, but there will still be time at the very end of the presentation that will open the floor for questions in general. And when we do that, you can just feel free to unmute yourself and ask some questions. I always forget this part. I'm Lauren. I am the director of the Illinois SBDC for Bill Bronzeville. We are also joined by Tamora Hughes, who is the director of the SBDC for Greater Englewood Community Development Corp. So with that, I will turn it over to Akile.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Lauren said, today we'll be talking about legal nuts and bolts for building a small business. So essentially, we'll be talking about basic legal considerations and arrangements that you'll need to build a small business. And this is whether, you're an aspiring entrepreneur or you're a current entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur. I think there's some helpful information in here for everyone. And even if you're already in operations, but you don't have a formal entity or legal structure created, there's some really important considerations that you'll want to think about as you start to build your business and grow it. A little background about myself. So as Lauren said, I'm an attorney at Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. So we call that CLC for short. So CLC manages a small business program, which I run. And our small business program, or through our small business program, we provide policy advocacy and legal assistance to small businesses. We do the majority of our direct service work, which would be counseling small businesses on legal issues that they face, all transactional matters, no litigation, but anything related to deal making and corporate governance and arrangements, real estate, all that stuff. We do the majority of that work through partnership with a private bar. And so we have multiple, dozens of Chicago and national member law firms whose volunteer attorneys, whose attorneys volunteer through us and provide pro bono legal counseling to small businesses. And we're also a civil rights organization. So outside of that, we have multiple other practice groups like voting and housing, equitable community development, which, there's business development practice groups that falls under, and do a lot of the typical sort of civil rights work that you would think of. But we also see that economic development is a critical piece of creating economic opportunity and an equitable society. And so we do this work as well. Before I came to Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, I worked at a few different private law firms, large law firms, doing general business law, M&A, securities, a lot of commercial law. And then I went in-house and worked for a fast-growing company. It was a startup at the time. It grew pretty fast, and I was just a sort of general in-house business attorney. So did a wide range of stuff, from real estate to, corporate and M&A, corporate governance, stuff like that, commercial contracts, vendor contracts, raising capital, all that. Not necessarily an expert in those areas. My core is the M&A and corporate and all that, and now economic development related work. So that's who I am. Looking forward to the presentation today. Again, as Lauren said, if you have any questions at the end, or have any questions, let's save them to the end, and I'll try to address as many as we can. This is just a disclaimer that this is for informational purposes. This is not intended to be, legal advice for your particular situation. We will answer some questions, but if you need, some particularized advice on your unique situation, then we'd recommend that you seek out an attorney, and we can connect you with one to go through and I'll talk more about this at the end, but we have an intake process where you can submit an inquiry form and all that, and be placed with a pro bono attorney, if you qualify. Then gotta do my promotional piece really quick. This is in partnership with Illinois Small Business Development Center, Greater Englewood Community Development Corporation, Build Bronzeville and Urban Juncture, and of course, Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. So the first topic that we're going to cover today is entity formation and governance. And so some things to think about here. I'm thinking about what sort of entity you should form and how you want that to be governed. And both of those go together. So it's not, you don't necessarily want to have one lead the other, but you just want to think about the impacts of a particular entity on how you will govern your business, and also think about how you want to govern your business and have that inform which entity you choose. Again, this will depend on who your business partners are, what your particular business objectives are and needs. There's no just one size fits all sort of thing. Most small entrepreneurs end up going with an LLC, which we'll talk about in a minute. But maybe a corporation or something else may work. There's different kinds of corporations and sort of in LLCs, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. So the basic sort of business legal entities are the sole proprietorship. This is probably the most common, and this is really, even when you were, maybe a kid and you're just like, I'm going to open a lemonade stand, and you didn't go to the Secretary of State, website and try to fill out a bunch of forms and pay a fee. You just sort of went out there, and maybe you got a license, probably didn't. I know I didn't, and you just start selling things. That's what we would call the sole proprietorship. It's usually just one person, running the business. There's no entities. You can still file, like your DBA, which is, the name that you're doing business by, as opposed to, just a Keely Parnell lemonade company. Maybe I would call it something else, something clever that I, can't think of right now. And you would call it with the county, that'll be your DBA. Somebody else that's off mute. If everybody can go on mute, that'd be great. So that's the sole proprietorship. The next is a partnership. There's different kinds of partnerships. We can go too complex detail. I mean, partnerships go from everything from a small, sort of mom and pop family sort of thing or maybe you have a friend and you want to join together with your friend to run a lemonade stand and you want to split the profits and there's nothing formal, that's a partnership. And then partnerships can also be these, huge sort of like venture capital, private equity, sort of firms that manage billions of dollars. Essentially, a partnership is when, two or more people, come together and agree to do business together and split the profits however they decide. That's a partnership. There's general partnerships where all those general partners are sort of equally exposed to, or not necessarily equally, but based on, how much money maybe they put in or whatever the case may be, exposed to liabilities and debts of the company as well as the profits. And then there's limited partners and there's limited partnerships. A lot of times these get put together in these interesting structures once you get to more complex sort of business models, but limited partners where they're only putting up money, they're not running the day-to-day business. They're not really responsible for certain things beyond what they put up. And those are limited partners. There's also the limited liability corporation. And this is actually a newer form of business entity, but everybody knows about it at this point. And it's probably the most common form of actual legal entity that you would form. It's the easiest and the most flexible to manage. It works really well for, a sort of single owner, one person wants to start an online business. They want some liability protection. The LLC is oftentimes the best fit for them. Again, you can form an LLC or a partnership or sole proprietorship, or need anything in the form of sole proprietorship, but you can form these in, any state in the U.S. And then there's also the corporation. And so both the limited liability company and the corporation provides you with some liability protection. And that's where the real benefit of the limited liability company and the corporation come into play. There's also limited liability partnerships. We're not going to go into all the details on those, but they provide some of the additional protections that you would get. And so with a limited liability corporation and company and the corporation, essentially the debts and obligations and liabilities of the company stay with the company. They don't go on to, the owners, you as the individual. If you and 5 of your friends get together and form an LLC and, you make a product that's just super dangerous and it gives everybody who tries it, a disease or COVID or something like that, and you get sued, they generally can't come after your personal assets. It's usually limited to the assets of the business, and whether that's the real estate that it owns, obviously the money that it has in its account, sometimes even the intellectual property, just whatever the assets of the company are. So their debts and obligations are limited to that. And then again, the way you would structure this, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is you go to the Secretary of State's website. They have some forms that you would fill out, and then you file those forms basically saying these are, the initial sort of founders of the company. This is how it's going to be managed. The limited liability company can be managed by its members, which are also the owners, or it can be managed by a board of managers, or a manager, which is essentially kind of like a board member / operator. It can be more just like a board member that you would traditionally think of with a corporation, or it can be more like a CEO and a board member sort of role. The limited liability company gives you a lot of flexibility there. The corporation, this is probably the most well-known form of business entity. You think about big companies, you think of a corporation, although typically these big companies are an amalgamation, a mixture of corporations and limited liability companies, and then even sometimes above that with owners, partnerships. And so corporations, there's a few different kinds. The main kind is your traditional C Corp, and then there's also an S Corp. A corporation is a separate legal entity from the people that are actually running the business, and it's separate from its owners, like the LLC. And so again, you form this by going to the Secretary of State, filing articles of incorporation or formation, depending on the state that you're in. It's basically just a document that says, this is how we want to structure. This is the person creating this corporation. These are the amount of shares that it will have. This is the value of the shares, and a few other details about how it will be structured and where to send notices and all that stuff in case the corporation is subject to a lawsuit or a lien or something like that. There's also some tax benefits there. With limited liability companies, they can be taxed as a partnership, which means essentially all the profits and losses flow through to the owners or the partners, and the company itself does not pay federal income tax. Or they can also be taxed as a corporation. Traditionally, a corporation, you've probably heard this concept before, faces double taxation, where they are taxed on the income that the corporation generates, and then the owners, the shareholders of the corporation, are also taxed. And so C Corps, follow that rule where they're taxed, they deal with double taxation, just like you hear. So the income is taxed, and then any distributions or dividends paid out to the owners, all that are taxed as well. You have the individual owners' tax rate based on their income, their personal income. And then with the S Corp is taxed more like a partnership. There are certain restrictions on forming an S Corp. Typically, you can't have more than 100 shareholders, but all the profits generated by the S Corporation flow through to the owners. There's also benefit corporations, I think we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then there's nonprofits. which are non-for-profit corporations. So they don't have owners, but they do have board of directors and similar obligations and similar structures to corporations. So when you think about which one of these you want to, depending on where you are, you want to think about, do you already have an entity formed? If you already have an LLC, it doesn't mean you can't become a corporation, but it may mean that you don't need to. You probably already have, enough flexibility to accomplish what you want to accomplish. Even though there may be some limits, you could probably accomplish much of the same thing that you could with a corporation. Do you have an agreement in place? If you're a partnership that you haven't formed, you haven't filed anything with the state to create like a limited liability partnership or anything like that, do you have an agreement in place? Even with a partnership, even though you're not filing anything with the state, you likely will still want to have some kind of agreement, some written partnership agreement with your partner that lays out how you're going to split profits, how you're going to run the business. Without that, that's just inviting legal issues and lawsuits. Another thing, are you current with your state filings? Certain entities require more filings than others. Corporations are more complicated to deal with from a state perspective. The state requires more reporting and filings and fees than a partnership would or a limited liability company. So that's something else to think about. Are you happy with your current entity? If you're starting out from scratch, I would start thinking about which entity. I wouldn't just run into business, and then how do you want to raise capital? That should also impact which of these you choose. Traditionally, corporations are the most flexible in terms of raising capital because of the share structure and all that. But oftentimes for small businesses, I've found that, the LLC works just fine, even with raising capital, unless you plan to be, we all have big dreams for our business, but unless you really think that you're going to become, a really, big to mid-sized company, and you're going to need to raise a lot of institutional capital or bring on a ton of investors, you may not need a corporation just to raise capital. You can still raise capital as an LLC. You can raise capital as a partnership, it just has to be structured right. And then liability, sometimes a sole proprietorship may make sense. You may be in a line of business that has very little liability exposure. Certain online businesses or services or whatever, just so limited. You're not necessarily selling or making any products and things like that. You're not providing professional advice. It could be something that is pretty low liability and it's just a path, maybe more like a hobby. And, you've got limited, discretionary funds. You don't want to spend any extra money forming a limited liability company or corporation. Sometimes that makes sense. And then you want to think about your succession plan when you're forming the entity. Who's going to help manage your business and all that. And where do you want to go? Do you want to sell this to someone else, or do you want to keep it within, you want to own it yourself or keep it in your family?
Okay, I had one question come up that I think was relevant to, as you were talking about, if you have an existing entity, thinking about, is there another form? So a question came up, if I have an S Corp, do I need an LLC in conjunction to protect my personal property?
No. If you have the LLC and the corporation offer very similar levels of liability protection. So if you have an S Corp, even though you're being taxed, the S Corp is really more so about tax treatment than it is about liability exposure. And so the one thing there is that when you do decide to elect to be taxed as a partnership, then you subject yourself to more audit exposure. So there's a risk from the IRS's perspective, but not so much from another creditor or a lawsuit or something like that.
Great, thank you.
And so in Illinois, I'm going to talk about, this doesn't cover Delaware again. Like most people form a corporation, or I'm going to say necessarily most people, a lot of businesses form their entities, whether it be an LLC or corporation in Delaware, just because Delaware sort of carved itself out as this, really pro-business, proximity to New York, but it created these interesting laws and really sort of made a name for itself, even though it's this really small state, which like hardly anybody lives in. that's really business friendly. And so Delaware has this long history of sort of court decisions around legal issues related to businesses that are really business friendly, and certain laws about, flexibility of running a corporation or an LLC that make Delaware a really popular place for businesses. That said, some industries will require you to be domiciled or, reside, like that business to reside or be formed in the actual state that you're operating in. And so I'm just going to touch on Illinois really briefly. There's, several laws that apply to Illinois businesses. There's corporation law, nonprofit, corporation law, LLC, partnership, associations. These are some references. I'm not going to get into details. Again, consult an attorney, but look at them too. I mean, it might make your eyes gloss over, and it may put you to sleep. You're having a hard time sleeping. Read some of this at night. I guarantee you will probably go to sleep. But when you want to navigate this, definitely get an attorney. There's also some on business and employment. The commercial code sort of governs what we call commercial transactions, which is a wide range of things, from financing and liens and things like that, to how you can sell products. And then there's also business transactions, which probably generally governs mergers and acquisitions between these different entities, and then of course employment law. So we talked about this before, the entity considerations, partnerships, 2 or more partners. It can be a handshake or an agreement. It can be 50-50. Profit and liability is shared. LLC, 1 or more members. Limited liability, you would want to sign an operating agreement, especially if there's more than one person. Even if there's one person, we recommend best practices to have an operating agreement, which is, for those probably not familiar with it, but it's an LLC agreement. It's kind of like bylaws for an LLC, and just governs how it will be managed, who the members are, how you can sell ownership in the business, whether or not it's managed by the members or the managers, and if so, how many members need to vote to do this, and how many members need to vote to do that. And it's just really good business practice to have all that laid out. Really prevents a lot of lawsuits and a lot of confusion when there is. There's also another similar LLC entity called the L3C, which is essentially kind of a hybrid LLC / nonprofit entity, which is the low profit LLC. It's that entity is new. It's really more about branding. If you want to brand yourself as, we're a business that's not just about, making ourselves rich. We're also about this social cause. And sometimes the L3C model might help in that. You might qualify for certain grants and stuff too. Again, corporations. So corporations are owned by shareholders, which I'm sure you've heard of before. Shareholders can also be, directors and officers and all those things. They don't have to be. And so corporations are ultimately governed by their board of directors and then their officers. The board of directors are at the top. They do less work, but they're at the top. And then the officers are the ones that carry out the day-to-day operations of the company. Again, there's limited liability, and the corporation pays tax as an entity, unless it's an S corp. The benefit corporation is kind of like a corporation plus. It's kind of like the L3C we talked about. The idea is that this corporation is also focused on some sort of providing some public service or benefit. B Corp corporation certification is possible. There's a link to find out more information about that. It can be taxed either way. This is really just a corporation that decides that to take on another sort of social commitment. On the corporate governance piece, again, this will impact which entity you choose. Who do you want to authorize to act on behalf of the business? The corporation, that's typically the officers and the directors too. And then those that, the board delegates that authority to. With the LLC, that's typically members, but there's a lot of ways that you can restrict that. With the partnerships, it's generally the partners. You can get to some of the places with a lot of these through your agreements. So that's why your partnership agreements, your LLC agreement, your bylaws, all that are very important. So if you're a corporation, you know, and want to think through, you know, who do you want on your board of directors? You know, you don't have to have tons of people. You know, it could just be you, and then you could have officers or something. You know, it depends on the state, depends on their rules. Um, and then there's also this concept of fiduciary duties, which is a legal term for saying that you have certain legal obligations to the corporation and its shareholders. These are like sort of ethical obligations to act within the best interest of the corporation and its shareholders, generally, and then also to, you know, inform, make wise decisions and good judgments, and do your research and all that. So next, we'll talk about capital raising. Again, this should also inform which entity you choose, but you know, there's a lot of different ways to raise capital for your business, and just talk about some of the legal considerations that you want to think about as you seek to raise capital and develop a financing plan. So why do you do it? Well, businesses live and die based on money. So, you know, if no money's coming in, the business probably is not going to be able to operate very long. And at the end of the day, the goal of starting a business, or at least one of the main goals, or the main goal, is to make money. Even if you're a benefit corporation, you know, your goal is to make money while doing good. The one exception would be if you're a non-profit, but even then, without any money, you can't really do a lot. So you need capital to grow your business, to fund your operations, to recapitalize. You know, if you pay debt and different obligations you have, rent, all that stuff, utilities, employees, you need cash to pay them. You need cash to acquire other companies, to buy equipment, all that stuff. The downsides of capital raising to think about. So with capital raising, there's a few different ways you can do it. You know, typically people think of it as, you know, you raise money through bringing on owners or investors. Investors, typically people mean, you know, new owners. So people, I'm going to sell you 5% of my business for, you know, $100,000 or whatever the case may be. In exchange, they get 5% of the business in stock or interest in the LLC or whatever. You can also do it by taking a loan. And so you can get a loan from a bank, you can get a loan from a private person, you can get a loan from, you know, another business. There's a lot of different ways to get a loan. And so that's something to think about. If you feel like your company is going to be worth a ton, you know, even if it takes on a lot of debt and you're the only owner, then you might not want to raise capital through equity financings, which is through the sale of ownership in your company. And so that's something to think about. But at the same time, in a lot of those, you know, businesses that, you know, are going to raise capital easily, investors are going to want ownership in the business because they say, I put in $100,000. You know, you take that and you use that to make the company grow. And now that $100,000 is worth $1 million or something like that. So that's the real upside of investing through equity. You can get to the same place through loans as well. If an investor says, you know what, I don't want any ownership in the company because I think y'all are going to go under, I'm going to give you a loan for $100,000 with an interest rate of 15%. That's where they try to make up that extra money that, you know, I don't think this business is going to grow, so I'm just going to try to make the money off of the interest. So those are things to think about. As the business owner, you want to think about that too, though. If there's a super high interest rate, it might not be a good deal. At the same time, if you know, a person wants half of your company for some equity, for some startup capital, then maybe that's not worth it. And then at the same time, when you give up equity, you lose voting control to a degree. So that's something else to think about. You can start to have control issues because then they can start to impact how you run the business or whether you elect, you know, board members or whatnot. So you want to be cognizant of the threshold that you need to to make really important business decisions. So that's something to reflect in your operating agreement. If it's an LLC and you say, hey, I need to bring on this person, you know, I started this business, I need to sell them 50% of the business to get enough money to get to where I need to be. Then maybe an operating agreement, which you still want control over the business, maybe an operating agreement, you need to say that we can't sell the business unless, you know, everybody agrees. 100% of the, of the owners or the members agree. So there's still ways to still put some protections in place. So you can still feel like you have enough control over your business, even if you raise a lot of capital through equity. Talked about the loan dangers. The biggest one probably is having a bad partner. In addition to the business terms of how you're raising money, the last thing you want to do is bring on an equity partner who's just not a good fit and difficult to work with. That could be a disaster. But also, there's some cost and time. If you're raising money through equity, there's a bunch of securities laws, which securities are essentially, sort of like these instruments that, like stocks and all that stuff that reflect ownership in a company or some sort of financial ownership. And so there's a lot of laws around when you can raise or sell equity in a company. So you want to comply with those. And in order to do that, 9 times out of 10, you need to get an attorney or some other company that just handles that kind of stuff and has their own attorney or something like that. But that stuff can get pretty complex, but you want to be aware of it. And so don't recommend necessarily just, doing that on your own. At least do some initial research. So again, on the capital raising piece, I mean, this is going to impact, your financials and business plan. You want to, when you're developing your business plan, be sure to include details about how you plan to access capital to finance your business. Even if you're putting up the money, you want to put that in there. Make that clear. Like, well, I'm putting up the $100,000 or whatever the case may be to finance this business, or another person is. With stock, I'm going to get too detailed into it, but there's, sort of your basic stock where, you have 1 share and you get 1 vote. That's it. And then there's also this concept called preferred stock, which is, maybe you own 1%, but you don't get to vote with that on certain matters. But then maybe there's something sort of like an interest rate tied to it, or you get a preference in when we pay dividends or we pay back initial investors. And so that can be captured in preferred stock. And you can do something similar to that with an LLC and a corporation. You can really drive the business terms here. You just want to lay all that out in the beginning. Think about it as you plan to develop the business. Again, we talked about debt. There's options and warrants. Warrants are essentially options to purchase equity in a company that's issued by the company, as opposed to a third party that's an owner of equity in the company. I wouldn't usually worry too much about that. That's usually for a little bit bigger corporations and things like that. You want to think about how much you want to pay, any employees that you have, if you hire someone to run your business and maybe you don't have time, or you have another business, think about the compensation there. And then we talked about securities law compliance, and there's state and federal laws. Both are really important. I would say the federal is probably the most scary, so you definitely want to make sure you're compliant with that. It's called the Securities Exchange Commission. I did a lot of that work before this, and companies become big and small, get in a lot of trouble by not complying with those. That can be disastrous. You can go to jail. So definitely make sure you comply with those. So next, we'll talk a little bit about contracts and negotiations. Here with your contracts, we're talking about, contracts is everything, so many things in business. It relates to, you forming your business and having that LLC agreement, which is a form of contract. That partnership agreement, that is a contract. But here we're just really talking about your vendor contracts and your supplier contracts. So when you get ready to start your business, you got to sign a lease, and then you got to, purchase, utilities, and then you got to sign a contract with, Verizon, have phone service and all that. All those are contracts. You need supplies to make your product. If you're making a product and you buy that from another person, there's a contract. You want to make sure the terms are as favorable as they can be. And you also want to make sure that the terms are set out in writing. You don't want to be, arguing with a supplier or vendor or a customer, for that matter, about what the terms of the purchase of goods or services were. So it's really important to have that stuff written down. I even think about what do I want, what if something goes wrong. That's when you really bring in attorneys too, to protect all this stuff, make sure the terms are clear, to make sure that you thought through the worst case scenarios, because sometimes those happen. And then how do I terminate a deal? Okay, you've been working with someone, they've been, selling you, sort of these basic buttons for your business that you put on and decorate and make into something that people want to buy. But then maybe that person says, hey, I'm jacking up the price, or our contract is up and, I want to walk away. What's in there? Or maybe you want to walk away. You want to have that spelled out in the beginning. So again, best practices here is clarity. Really make sure that it's clear that, you provide me with, 10 widgets every third Wednesday of the month by this date, or, I get a discount, or I don't have to pay you anything, or whatever happens. Be sure to spell that out. On the enforcement piece, if you don't do this, then these are my remedies. This is what I can do. It doesn't necessarily have to be sue you in court. It can be other things. I think oftentimes the enforcement mechanisms that you sort of want going to court to be your last sort of last ditch option. So you want to think about that, and then protecting your legal rights. Also in the contracts, you want to think about, okay, I signed a contract with this supplier, and I don't want everybody to know that I, struck this kind of bad deal because I just really needed this product from this person. Well, then maybe consider a confidentiality or non-disclosure sort of paragraph or clause in there, so that they can't run and tell the world that Achilles signed this bad deal. We're taking advantage of him. It's great. So that's something to consider. Or if you just, generally there's other topics in there, or even the subject of the agreement. You may not want other folks, except for maybe the government, to even know that you signed a contract. That's something else to consider. At the end of the day, just to keep it simple, you want to put your agreements in writing. An agreement doesn't have to be in writing. An agreement can be a handshake or a verbal agreement. Those can be enforceable, but it's just really difficult. It's a lot easier to have that in writing. So even if it's something small, if it relates to your business, or even sometimes in your personal life, get that in writing. Let's see, counterparties, make sure that you know the other person that you're contracting with, because if you don't, and it can be a real challenge. And make sure you do your diligence. So if someone does agree to form a contract with you, make sure that you know their actual legal entity name, or if you sign a contract with Joe Blow LLC, like, you want to make sure that's a real company. Don't just take them at their word. Go and sometimes bring in an attorney, or look it up on the Secretary of State's website and say, okay, is this a real LLC? I don't see it. Maybe you look it up and you don't see it. Let them know. I don't see your entity name. Can you clarify? Just makes things easier when you go to enforcement and tracking them down. Another good tip on forming contracts is to get the other party's mailing address, like their formal business mailing address and phone number. Have all that written out in the agreement. If there's updates, there should be an obligation to update that, just so you don't have any issues contacting folks in case you need to reach them or something goes wrong. Other, sort of issues that you just got to address are, what are the goods and services being provided? What is the price? When do I need to pay? When do I need to be paid? Are there any warranties or promises? If you sell me, 100 widgets, like, I need a warranty that these will work. It can't just be as is, or maybe it is that. It just needs to be clear. What other rights do we have if, something goes wrong? And then in the case that someone does not follow the terms of the agreement, we're going to address breach, which is when someone breaks, one of their agreements, or, all of the agreements in the contract. And then a cure period is usually, this is a concept that people put in contracts, where if you do break the terms of an agreement, you have a certain amount of days to fix it before I drag you into court, or before I make you pay additional fees or whatever. So, if that's something you want, if you think you're more likely to breach, then you'll want to push for that in your agreement. If you think the other person is more likely to breach and you're just not feeling generous that day, take that out. And then you want to think about cancellation or termination. Do you want this agreement to be for 12 months or 3 years? This is probably the biggest thing to address after just laying out what it is I'm contracting for, what is the price, how long is this agreement going to last, how do you get out? Because the last thing you want to be is stuck in an agreement, stuck working with somebody or buying some stuff that you don't want. And so you want to really negotiate that. Usually the party with more leverage that needs the product or service the least is the one that usually probably wouldn't want to have a termination clause in there or a generous cancellation provision, but definitely as much as you can, try to get that in there. And then sometimes consider coming up with boilerplate agreements. If you have a lot of customers, then you can come up with, these sort of just standard, you get this when you go sign up for, a service, whether it's Verizon or Comcast. They have these just standard agreements that have all these terms in there that are favorable for them, and they try to push them on you because they have that leverage. And so it doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be exploited. It can just be easy and effective and just makes things easier. But if you know you're going to be signing a lot of contracts, you might want to look into just having contracts. And again, I think we touched on this a lot before. Practice your negotiation skills. Read some other commercial contracts to see what they're addressing in theirs that are similar to what you might be doing. Be sure to protect your trade secrets, your intellectual property. If you're signing a licensing agreement for some sort of business concept or good or service for somebody else to use, make sure that's properly protected. And at the end of the day, talk to an attorney. And don't try to necessarily do this stuff yourself. We're here as a resource to help with that. I'll touch briefly on employment and labor, and then we'll talk about trademarks and try to wrap up by 3 so we can have time for questions. So yeah, this is an issue. If you're going to have employees, or if you think you will have employees, you want to think about how many employees, where are they going to be, how are you going to manage payroll, and there's a lot of compliance issues when it comes to employment and labor law, as you all know. I'm not an expert on this. You have to talk to an attorney on this stuff, but there are some good guides out there to give you the sort of fundamentals. The one thing here, and this presentation doesn't address this, is that this area has become more complicated because of COVID. And so, that makes it even more important to talk to an employment attorney now, because the last thing you want to do is be out of compliance or subjecting your employees to, unreasonably dangerous or, health-threatening work environments. So employment law can be a lot of different things, from, how much you pay your employees to whether or not they can use recreational cannabis outside of work. It's a big issue now in Illinois, to racial and sexual discrimination and harassment. There's certain training that might be required depending on what industry you're in and what kind of employees you have. And then just generally, is this an employee or an independent contractor? And classifying those folks properly and making sure you're paying all the applicable employment related taxes and stuff is important. And so you definitely want to consult with an attorney and probably an accountant on all that. So we'll touch on intellectual property, go a little bit more in depth here than employment law, but this is another huge area where here you're just really focusing on protecting sort of basic company assets. So your brand, your products and services, if you make them, or if you come up with formulas and things like that. You want to make sure that all that is protected and considered, something that you own. And then if you allow other people to use that, you want to make sure that you structure those agreements in a way that you can, you're paid adequately for the value in the goods and services that you're providing. And so intellectual property generally falls into about 4 categories. There's actually more. I'm not going to go too in-depth detail on those, though. But there's copyright, there's trademark, there's patent, and then there's also trade secrets. And so let's see, we'll start with copyrights. So copyrights basically, um, they give the creator of creative work or original work the exclusive right to, you know, use this, creative work for a limited amount of time. So often you see copyrights with like music, art, things like that. And so there's a lot of copyright suits related to, music samples. So, I can't just go and take, you know, a sample from a Kanye West song and then just rap over it and then go sell it to a whole bunch of people without him, agreeing to it. And usually he wouldn't agree to it unless I agreed to pay him a certain amount, if at all. And so the reason is because he has copyright protection, or someone does, whether it's a label or whoever has copyright protection over that creative art. And so this is a wide range of stuff. It even sort of comes into play when it comes to trademarks and stuff. But, say for your company, you create, not necessarily a logo, but something that's distinctive that just goes around it or whatnot, that would be a copyright too. So for trademarks are recognizable signs and designs or expressions which are meant to distinguish a product or service or good. So like Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, like with that, I don't even know what to call that, but that little thing up there, that's like a trademark. I would say like Goodyear, Nike, the check mark, and all that together is like a trademark. And so Nike owns that. You can't use that. You can't sell goods and products with that on there without, being in a violation of law and subject to lawsuits. And so trademark protection is available at the state and at the federal level on most things. One exception is cannabis. Last time I checked, you can't really get trademark protection at the federal level, which means nationwide. So sorry, federal would mean nationwide for cannabis products like plant, like a strain or something like that. But you could get it for something that's like an ancillary business or something. So if you make, you know, lighters or holders or trays or whatever else, anything except for the actual substance, then you can get trademark protection. And then patent protection. So patents are more scientific sort of works and processes that you can also, so basically you think about inventions. Inventions are patents. So I develop a cure for, COVID-19 or something like that. I could get that process and all that stuff specifically patented, probably. And then trade secrets are also certain formulas, practices, and processes, designs, compilations of information that are not generally known, and that allows me to obtain some sort of like economic advantage or business advantage over another competitor. So that would be like the formula for Coca-Cola, and there can be some overlap. I think you probably get that formula patented too, but that would be a trade secret. So here it's really important, again, to consult an attorney. But I would recommend sort of just Googling, copyright and trademarks. Usually most businesses are mainly focused on the first two, which copyrights and or trademarks. Trademark is the big one. Oftentimes that's the first one. It's just protecting your brand. And so you can get, state trademark protection fairly easily, and then you can get federal. And a lot of these, even if you haven't, submitted all the applications and all the filings required for official intellectual property protection, you can still get some protection through just being first to market with an idea. So if you're the first one, say I'm the first one to come up with the idea of Nike, and I start selling shoes called Nike with a check mark, and I haven't filed for protection yet, but I've been doing it for like 5 years, in Colorado. And then another company comes along in Illinois and they come up with the same thing. And then they try to come to Colorado and do it. I can almost certainly, have them, I can probably sue them, potentially get them to stop selling their product in the state where I started doing it first. And sometimes if it's nationwide, you could potentially get that nationwide, but it's really important to actually file and have that stuff protected and not just rely on court decisions to protect your business assets. So we touched on this, names, you're going to have your trademarks and copyrights and all that stuff on your website, your publications, your logos, the work. If it's really a work of art, it could be copyright and trademark. So here's some intellectual property resources to find out more. The sort of main place to go, they can get a little complicated, is the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And so you can learn a lot about just, intellectual property policy at the national level. And you can also find out more information about how to file for, federal, national protection. But some is easy, like trademarks is actually fairly easy. But patents is certainly very tricky. I don't pretend to know that much about it. Trade secrets can get a little complex too, as well as copyrights. So I'll touch on some legal resources that are available. So the city of Chicago has a small business resources center. It's still closed right now, but when they were open, it's on the 8th floor of City Hall. They're generally open from 8:30 to 4:30, and they help small businesses or businesses of all sizes with licensing, zoning, and they provide a bunch of other business resources and guidance outside of legal. I know that we would staff attorneys there every Wednesday to provide just short, brief legal consultations. And once stay-at-home order or once everything officially opens again, then I think we'll be back. They're available as well, and that's just pop in. But you can also sign up for a certain time. The Illinois State Bar Association, which is a legal state bar association for the state of Illinois, has lots of consumer guides, classes that are free that you can go online and just find out more about legal issues without talking to an attorney. And then Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, our organization, we also have a lot of resources that you can go and read on if you want more information about trademarks and copyrights and all that. We have some publications online. Same thing with real estate and zoning, entity formation. We have a lot of that online. And then we also provide transactional legal assistance. So not directly, so it's not, you wouldn't necessarily just call and get help, but you fill out an inquiry form, which you have a link to right there. And you can also find it on our website. You go to our website and then go to our small business section, and you basically fill that out and talk about the legal issue you have, which community partner you're referred from, and then we will have someone follow up with you, and they'll set up a time for you to speak if you qualify. There's certain conditions to qualify, but a lot of small business owners, especially from any of these community partners, would qualify. And then we connect you with an attorney either for a short consultation. You may want to just talk to someone for 30 minutes. We can schedule that. Or if you have, you say, I'm trying to close on a round of financing and I need an attorney to help draft the documents and walk me through the process and represent me as I negotiate this with a bank or another party, we can connect you with an attorney to do that as well. And then if you have legal questions that are maybe outside of the work that we do, we don't necessarily do everything, especially anything outside of transactional legal work. If you have a litigation issue or something, or you may own a business with your spouse, and then you may end up getting a divorce, and now that becomes a marital property issue. We don't handle things like that, but there are other legal organizations that do. So we recommend Carpals, which is a pro bono legal aid hotline. They also have online help. Legal Aid Chicago is on there. You can go online. I believe you can submit questions. Prairie State Legal Services is another. And then if you don't qualify for our services because maybe you make too much money or something like that, there's the Justice Entrepreneur Project, and that's private attorneys that provide more flexible rates, more affordable rates for small businesses that may be doing fairly well or just don't qualify for legal services through us. All right, and then again, here's the contact information for all of the partners for today. If you need appointments on whether it's marketing or brand development, finance, business strategy, operations, or legal, you can reach out to all these great resources for more information. And now we'll take any questions that anyone has.
Just before we move on to questions, Akili, can you go back just to that last slide for a minute?
Yeah.
So a couple of things, guys. The inquiry form that he mentioned on the prior slide, there's also a short link for it here. The bit.ly link, if you want to jot that down, that'll take you directly to the inquiry form. One of the things to just kind of stress and note, the more kind of prepared and thought out that you are, that, you know, as far as like in your business planning process that you are, the better the lawyers that are providing their services can help you, right? So one of the things that they, you know, require is that you have a business plan.
Yep.
You know, the point is to assist you to, you know, to check off those legal requirements and help you, you know, get your setup done, get your trademark filed, you know, I know that we deal in for-profits, but let's say that you want to have a nonprofit arm of your for-profit business, to file for, you know, your nonprofit status, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not, you know, so much just to kind of talk through the process and bounce ideas off the wall, right? But it's to come to be able to get, as he said, those transactional legal things done. So that is also just kind of a nod to making sure that you connect with your business advisors at either GCDC or Bell Brownsville so that we can help you get to that point where you have all of those, you know, have the business plan in place and you can very thoroughly and thoughtfully go through your business with a lawyer that they connect you with to get those things accomplished.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
And now we'll open the floor for questions. So if anyone has any questions, there are no more questions in the chat. But if there are any questions, I mean, we're over by about 3 minutes, but certainly if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask. I'll kind of leave the floor open for a minute or so. And if there are no questions, we'll wrap things up. But any questions? No, I don't see anyone taking themselves off mute. Okay. Well, thank you again. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Akili, for presenting this information. It was very, very useful and very informative, so I appreciate it. Guys, please utilize this resource. It's a great thing to be able to have access to attorneys for free. This presentation or this webinar was being recorded or is being recorded, and we will send out the recording as well as the presentation itself afterwards for you to be able to go through. Yeah, it looks like there are no questions. So with that, we're gonna conclude things. Thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Take care.
Yeah.